screen for you.
Can you see this?
We can indeed.
First slide.
The
Okay.
first slide. So, Dr. Coles, the floor is yours, sir, for the Lost Angels of a Ruined Paradise.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And it's, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. It's great that we can actually do this despite the fact that it's still not really so easy to meet in person. I must say that, like all of you, I prefer the meet in person. There's some kind of energy that comes when, because I can't see you, you can see me in my living room. Anyway, back to the talk. I wasn't expecting to be the first of the day, but it's quite an exciting challenge for me. Let me unpack the title of this first of all. Lost Angels of a Ruined Paradise. It really is a quote that comes from Shelley, from Adonais. But I originally came across it in a book by the Edwardian poet and writer and critic Edward Thomas, in his book Pursuit of Spring. He talks about cycling down the Wandsworth Road, past Wandsworth Common, and seeing old trees in orchards by the side of the road, and wondered where they'd come from and from which ruined paradises these lost angels had come. And I had been working on a global history of the mulberry tree, and also a survey and inquiry into London's mulberry trees and their history. And it seemed to me like the best kind of summary of what it is that this project, which is called Morus Londinium, is all about. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about that. Just a little bit about me, just 2 seconds. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Urban and Community Research at Goldsmiths, but I'm also one of the co-founder and project director of a project called Morus Londinium, which has been running since 2016, and the author of a book called Mulberry. So what's all this about? And you can go to the website to see more about it if you need to. It's about documenting and preserving London's mulberry tree heritage. And this is a kind of a citizen science survey in that people who know of mulberry trees around London, or it was really originally within the M25, but it's now a national thing, let us know, and we enter them into a database, verify various things about them, and any of the interesting ones in terms of their age, size, place, whatever, we follow up, and then write a little note that then goes onto the website that people can consult. So it becomes a two-way thing. There's also independent research and walks, talks, and so on. More of the walks and talks, of course, when there is not a pandemic on. So, okay, first of all, why a survey of veteran urban trees at all? A book that I came across a long time ago was by Oliver Rackham, who in this book, which was actually the book published about his PhD, I think, in Cambridge, where he mentions the idea of an archaeology of landscape, and he's really looking at woodland and how you can tell how ancient a woodland is, and find out quite a lot about it by looking at it, the trees, the species, and so on, and also things like ditches and various other characteristics of the wood. But I just really like this idea of archaeology of landscape. Now, in this book, in the first few pages, Rackham explicitly says he's not going to be concerned with all of the trees that I'm actually particularly interested in. So he excludes trees that have been deliberately planted, trees that are in gardens, parks, and in urban areas. Now, these are all of the characteristics of the trees that I am going to be talking about. And the reason that I'm interested in urban trees is because they can, because for reasons I shall explain in just a second, indicate levels or layers of our city's history which have been covered over by development. Now, the project itself, and just this is the kind of baseline of where all the information comes from that I'm going to be talking about. It's more than a map of veteran trees. There are other maps of trees around, and this is partly a tree project. There are tree fans and mulberry tree fans who are very interested in our project because they can find trees that they can go look at, which are fascinating in their own right. And these are the lost angels, if you like. But it's also a map of London's hidden tangible and intangible heritage. I say intangible because of things like the silk industry, which is related to mulberries, not the ones I'm really going to be talking about today. So you have the whole area and the kind of intangible heritage that in different areas of London that have associations with Huguenots, with silk industry and so on. And these are the ruined paradises. These are the tangible and intangible examples of heritage that the mulberry trees can reveal. Why am I seem to be running into a... there we go. So why mulberries and why black mulberries? Because we're going to be talking about black mulberries. There are three kinds: black, white, and red. Red you only really find in the US. The white mulberries are the Chinese mulberries, and they've now spread all across the world, and they have become something of a weed and an unwanted exotic alien species in the United States. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to be talking nearly all about black mulberries. And why black mulberries rather than the others is because 99% of all the mulberries in the UK that are over 100 years old are in fact black mulberries. The only old white mulberry that I know of is in the Botanic Gardens in Oxford, and that's just over about 120 years old. So why mulberries then, rather than other long-lived trees like oak or yew? And there are a number of reasons for these. Is that they're not native, and therefore they're not going to be found randomly, because a pigeon or a blackbird or a jay or something has dropped a seed somewhere. They've nearly always been deliberately planted. Morus nigra was introduced by the Romans in the 1st century. And we know this because some mineralized seeds have been found in various archaeological sites, one of which was very near to London Bridge. And these are held in the Museum of London. But it doesn't really self-seed here, so you're not likely to find random mulberry trees around the place that have been dropped by birds or whatever. They're most often deliberately planted, and in a number of different ways, by cuttings, or the tree itself will propagate by layering, and I'll explain what this is in a moment, where it's able to put down roots even if it's chopped back right down to the ground, or if a branch falls on the ground and so on. And truncheons, these are bits of branch that are pushed about a metre into the ground. But another reason that they're interesting is that they're long-lived. So that gives us a possibility of tracing their history back 300-400 years, maybe even longer in some cases. And they're also comparatively rare, so we're not talking about something that we're just going to find everywhere, and therefore have to sort out old trees from ones that aren't so old and so on. You see a mulberry tree, you can tell fairly quickly whether it's 70, 80, 90, 100 years old or even older. And this makes the black mulberry trees useful indicators of old orchards, gardens, parks, and their associated built heritage, which may have disappeared. This might be a manor house or something like that, which has had large grounds, had mulberry trees in it, and the manor house has been knocked down, the grounds have been reclaimed and developed. From 2016, when we started our project, we've had something like 1,500 entries from the general public. Some of these are spam, increasingly. Some of them, they're just kind of joke entries, if you like. Some of them are duplicates, because people, oh, do you know about the mulberry here? And they send it in, but we've already got that in our records. But at least 1,000, probably more, are unique entries. And of those, 500 or so are interesting and old mulberry trees. And this survey, looking through the data that we've got of trees that we didn't know about because they're in back gardens or they're in odd places, has uncovered a number of old mulberry trees, which is interesting in its own right, because they were just hidden from view. And as Val will know, there are many in Chiswick, for example, that are in the back gardens of houses, and you just can't know that they're there unless you are able to go into that garden. Also traces of pleasure gardens, which were called mulberry gardens at one time, and especially in the sort of late 17th and 18th century, disappeared manor houses and so on. Now the survey works, this is roughly a kind of a bit of a view of what happens. Each number represents the number of trees. If I zoom in, I should be able to look at. And the thing works in two ways. You can actually go in to the project, go into the map, zoom in, and you'll find a particular tree. You can click on it, and then you'll see a little pop-up window. And sometimes if I've written a blog piece about it or something, or one of the invited guest writers has done, you'll find a much more detailed account. Now, when John Bryce originally talked to me about the project and what it might be, and when I was investigating it, the idea of resilience came up and London's ability to spring back. But I kind of somehow in my mind conflated the notion of survival with that of resilience. And it was only really when I started to prepare my talk for today that I often like to know the real meanings of things and what their etymology is and the origin of the words. And of course, survival is carrying on, really, to continue to live after the death of something or the disappearance of something. Whereas resilience has a different component to it, which is literally from the Latin, I suppose, to spring back. And quite interestingly, black mulberries, I thought, first of all, I thought, oops, because I'd actually thought about survival. I've often talked about the black mulberries, old black mulberries, as being survivors of a lost past or a disappeared past. And I thought, oh, oops, I'm talking about survivors, whereas actually this is about resilience. It's about springing back after something has happened. And then I just thought, not for very long, well, black mulberries actually display both properties. Let me first talk about survival for a little bit, and I'll come back to these more examples in a moment. Many of you may have seen the Buster Keaton film Steamboat Bill, and this particular scene, he did his own stunt, so this was he did have a real chance of being seriously injured in this. And in thinking about one particular tree, which I'll show you later on, this image came to my mind. I remembered it very well. And so Buster Keaton survives miraculously. And there is a tree in Lewisham, in what's now called the Renaissance or Olympic Vale development, which is a housing development in Elmira Street, not far from Lewisham Station, which is on the other side of the road. And this shows all the properties of the Buster Keaton survival. The present housing development is on the site of 1970s Sundermead estate, which was demolished to make way for the present site. But in fact, so the tree survived that demolition, but it was also there when the Sundermead estate was built in the 1970s. And the Sundermead estate itself is on the site of a much earlier housing and kind of like mills, flour mills and so on, development, which itself was knocked down to make way for the Sundermead estate. And looking back through the archives, especially map archives, I've been able to roughly locate the tree that still stands today, was planted in the playground of a boys' school in the 19th century, which was knocked down as part of this whole development. So there you have this notion of survival. A tree miraculously, and it's often not the case with developers these days, they like to remove trees that are in the way. Lewisham Council in this case has kept this tree, despite 2 whole cycles of demolition and development. So that's an example of survival. Let's look at resilience. Mulberry trees have this phoenix property of being able to regrow once they've been damaged or chopped down. This tree here on the left was on the site of the campus of Greenwich University, next to what's called the Stephen Lawrence Library, I think now, the Dreadnought building. And I'd spotted it as one of the 14 different mulberry trees in this area. And I'd wanted to lead a walk around the trees in Greenwich. I went to reconnoitre the walk, having photographed this tree, and it wasn't there. And I thought, well, I'm mad, where's it gone? And I looked very closely at the area where I thought it was, and I found this little stump left with 2 little mulberry trees, leaves kind of sprouting out again. In fact, there are more. So they all come back, and I was sort of overjoyed by this. I don't actually think it has grown back, but it had the potential to, and that's obviously what it wanted to do. And that process is called layering. Now, there's a spectacular example of this, which unfortunately the public can't see, which is in the mulberry orchard, which is in the private grounds of Sion House, most of which you can visit, but this part you can't. And this orchard dates back to when the Sion House was a Brigittine monastery in the actually the 15th century, but certainly in the 16th. We don't know whether this tree, whether the trees in the orchard are that old, but we know that they are certainly early 16th century. And here you find one tree. This is just a little bit of it layering. In other words, branches have fallen on the ground, and they're sending up what would have been side shoots, which are now becoming trees. Eventually, the bits in between them will rot away, and you'll have what looks like a grove of trees. This is Sion House, which is built, as I said, on the site of a requisitioned Brigittine monastery during the dissolution. I won't go into great details of it. And this particular tree is in the water meadow, and does date back to that. And if you look back at maps, you'll find, and we've done some georeferencing on this, that it corresponds to a little bit where the mouse is here, of grounds that have now also been destroyed. And you'll see that there is an orchard marked on this particular map that does go back to the time of the monastery. Now, I'm doing some research on this with a number of people, and some of their names here: Laurie Elvin, Topher Martin, are members of the Sion Archaeological Research Association, and with the help of the Duchess of Northumberland. More of this at another time. But these are some of the trees that you can find in the orchard there. Now, this, trying to look for a bit of theory sometimes, I don't know. I was reminded of a book that influenced me as an undergraduate, that's written by, it's a popularizing science book by Evan Schrödinger, called What is Life? And the take home for that, for me at the time as an undergraduate, was this notion of negative entropy, or negentropy, which is where the second law of thermodynamics, which is that everything tends to seek a state of equilibrium, which is basically chaos, where all the atoms and molecules are the same, where that's temporarily suspended by the process of metabolism, where living matter tends to go towards order and structure and so on, whereas the inert matter tends to decay. And Schrödinger writes, when a system that is not alive is isolated, the whole system fades away to a dead inert lump of matter. The physicist calls this the state of thermodynamic equilibrium, or of maximum entropy, whereas the living organism tends to avoid this by metabolism. So I thought one of the reasons why old trees and the natural heritage is interesting in an urban context when we're looking at history is precisely this, that they have a tendency to keep going, whereas everything around them is falling apart. Now, coming back to the lost angels of a ruined paradise, the project is really about finding these lost angels, and that's what the survey is. Okay, and then tracing back using archival research, what's known about them, maps and so on, their ruined paradises. So these are trees with roots in possibly lost gardens. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the history of London's mulberries. I've written about this elsewhere. But just using this little map, you can see that you can trace mulberry trees back in one sense to the 1st century. The oldest mulberry technically in London is some fossil mineralized pips, I should say, which are in the Museum of London's archives. And then the mulberry tree sort of disappeared, except that it continued to be grown in medieval gardens and monasteries. There are still references to mulberries in Tudor houses. Then, of course, there was the dissolution, and many of the monasteries were destroyed, and they were actually then requisitioned and turned into houses by the aristocracy. And if there was a mulberry tree there, for various reasons, which we can go into perhaps in the Q&A if you like, people tended to want to keep them. So they were preserved even though the monastery was destroyed. And Sion House is a great example of that. There was an effort in the early 17th century by King James VI and I to start the silk industry here. Mulberry silkworms will only feed on mulberry leaves. And he imported tens of thousands of mulberry trees for this project, which didn't last more than his own reign, really. But some of the trees survived. Then we have another effort again in the 18th century to start the silk industry again that didn't last very long. And then you find the mulberry tree. By then it's become quite well known and people like them for their landscape value and the fruit, and they tend to plant them for those reasons, continuing in the 19th and 20th centuries. If we have a quick look at the monastery mulberries, there are no actual surviving mulberries from those times, from the 15th century, except the ones in Sion, which I think are perhaps the prime candidate. That's still an open question. We need to look at that a bit more. But an example of a mulberry tree that's in the grounds of a ruined monastery is at Lesnes Abbey in southeast London. And you can see in the background the ruins, some of the excavated ruins of the abbey. When you look at that, you think, well, how old is this tree? And local people like to think that it goes back to the time of the abbey. But if you look at some of the archives, you realize that there was the prior had some lodgings here in this part of the, I suppose it's the north-west part of the site. And this was subsequently turned into a farmhouse, which dated back to Henry VIII's time at least. And subsequently this was destroyed and another farmhouse replaced it. This was the original building, timber framed building. And a farmhouse was built on the site and was, I think, destroyed in the 1930s when the London County Council took the site over. Now there's a tree over here on the right, which could be the mulberry tree. You can also see a tree inside the walled garden, which is roughly in the same place. I don't know, but the tree could easily be a couple of 100 years old anyway, and belonged to the farmhouse, but not to the original ruins of the abbey. There are other monastery sites that have mulberries. Again, they don't date back to the original time. I won't go into any great detail about these. Charterhouse has one. There's one next to the nave, next to the Lady Chapel of St. Bartholomew the Great. And there was a much older mulberry tree there. And some of the plans of the original priory show that there was what we call a mulberry garden near to the infirmary. Very briefly, I won't go into the Silk Project, but James I started this project. He planted 10,000 trees in the grounds of what would now be part of Buckingham Palace grounds. There are no mulberry trees dating back to that period, but there are scions, in other words, sort of offcuts, if you like, of trees that go back to that time that are available, I think, through Chelsea Physic Garden and one or two other places called King James Mulberries. The Silk Project filtered out mostly because the weather was bad, and the silkworms couldn't hatch at the same time as the young leaves were available, and nobody knew how to look after them properly. But at the same time, the colonies were developing in Virginia and Georgia, and James transferred the whole enterprise over there, where it did actually finally take off. But he started these plantations of mulberries in other places apart from Buckingham, what was then Goring House, or became Goring House. Others in Greenwich, Theobalds, Charlton, Moatlands, which I'll come to a little bit later on. The horticulturalist and writer on natural history, John Claudius Loudon, said there is, as a result of this failed enterprise, there's hardly an old garden or gentleman's seat throughout the country which can be traced back to the 17th century, in which a mulberry tree is not to be found. So one of the easy things to do, if you like, would be to find Jacobean houses and find the mulberries if they're still there. And there are many of those. A colleague called Stephen Bow has done this, and there are something like, he's documented something like 100 trees throughout the country that are associated with Jacobean buildings. Charlton House is the one in London, really, that has that claim. This tree is probably planted around 1611 when the house was built. It was built for Sir Adam Newton, who was tutor to Prince Henry, the son of King James. As it turns out, this tree was possibly not part of a plantation that was destined to feed silkworms. It's a black mulberry. We now know from in the 1800s, there was a sale of 200 mulberry trees from the grounds of Charlton House. And we don't really know where they were or what happened to them. They're probably chopped up. And my feeling is that they may well have been white mulberry trees. And that this belonged to a garden, a formal garden. But somebody else is doing some research on this at the moment. This is the house. So there's no mystery really when you find a mulberry tree that goes back to the early 1600s associated with a house that was built then. Other examples of this, Theobald's, which is now Cedar Park near Enfield, and you have some of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges like this one in Christ, Cambridge, planted around 1609. The ones that really interest me, and these are the Lost Angels, where it makes sense and it's fun to look at the ruined paradises, are places like Sayes Court, where you have a tree now in a park, surrounded by grass and much younger trees, and other buildings, housing developments, Pepys Estate, and so on. But when you go back into the archives, you find that this was actually the site of the diarist John Evelyn's home, Sayes Court, and a garden which he mapped in which there was a mulberry tree marked with a cross right at the top here, which corresponds sort of, not exactly to where this particular tree is now. So this is an example, and this is the one that triggered my whole interest in this work of finding these old trees, tracing them back and finding out what their story is. Another one that was signalled through the website is in Colston Way in Streatham Park in South London, and it's known as Dr. Johnson's Mulberry. And when I first came across it, it was standing outside Emmy's grocery convenience store, surrounded by a little island to protect it. And tracing it back, the reference was already to the time that Dr. Johnson spent in a building that was in the house of the Thrale family, who were wealthy brewers, which was actually on this site. And when I did some geolocation, GPS work, I found that the Colston Way one is here, but I found that there were two others, one here and one in a private house up here, which is actually a Boise house. It's in the back garden of that, but I was able to go and see it. And the person who showed me this one in Mulberry Close nearby said, oh, well, there used to be another one, but it was sawn down. And she took me around and I could just see the stump where the X is here. So you have these four trees that kind of validate in a way the presence of mulberry trees. And I've looked to see that the site was not developed during that time. So they would all date back to the time the Thrales had their house there. Unfortunately, the tree in Colston Way was hit by a gust of wind in a storm and lost a branch, and the council decided to cut it down. But as you can see here, in the theme of resilience, it's sprouting back again. And this is one of the other ones in Mulberry Close nearby. Another odd one is near where I live in northwest London, Belsize Park. There's this tree that everyone knows who lives there. It's an old mulberry tree. It's been coppiced, or it's been pollarded, rather, I should say. It's been cut back, so it's got this kind of stunted, stumpy form. It's nearly 3 meters around, which does put it back quite comfortably into the early 1800s. And it's on the site of Belsize Manor, which was the grounds were built upon to make Belsize Park as it stands today. And that's possibly the only survivor. There is a wall actually that goes back to Tudor times, which is nearby. But another one which came through the website, somebody said, oh, I've got an old mulberry tree. I know of one in my grandmother used to live in some flats on Park Gardens in Chelsea, and there used to be an old tree there. So I followed it up, found out that there was still an old mulberry tree there, and then thought, well, why is it there? And did a bit of research, and it's actually on the site of something called, it was the Raw Silk Undertakings efforts in the early 1700s, 1720s to start a silk industry. 2,000 mulberry trees were planted in what became Chelsea Park. And you can see, going back in time, you can see it, the area being developed. And this was in Wharton's Fields. This is the area that was sold off, and used to at one time to belong to Thomas More as part of his estate, which was down here at the bottom. So looking for lost angels, some of these the trees that are not in the glamorous sites, like associated with existing Jacobean buildings. Eltham Palace has one, for example, which is Tudor. There are others up and down the country, the Oxford colleges and so on. These are all trees that are in places where the buildings are still standing. But there are many other trees, and these are the ones I'm really interested in, I suppose I should confess, especially from a local history point of view. These are the kind of minor characters. They're trees that are clearly older than the buildings around them. I'm interested in why they're there. So this is Avenue Close, St John's Wood, in front of 1930s housing development. Looking back through the archives, we find it was on the site of a large house called the Poplars. You can see it's quite a grand building, and this is where the red arrow points is roughly where the tree is. You could argue that it belonged to the house next to it. My GPS is not accurate enough to be absolutely sure. And this is the house, which I think is amazing. You can't see the kind of fan shape of it from the rear, but this is the only picture I could find of it. And the history of what this house, who it belonged to, was quite interesting. It belonged to, eventually, at the time that we're most interested in, belonged to Ludwig and Frieda Mond in the 1880s. And Ludwig Mond and his assistants accidentally discovered a way to purify nickel, and this gave rise to ICI eventually, when he associated with some other people. And there's still a bust of him for his discoveries on Imperial Chemicals House on Millbank. It was quite a famous building. There were even drawings of its interior and some building magazines. And the Monds, being sort of socialites, commissioned a couple of busts, which are copies of Greek classical figures. And these were in their house at the foot of the stairs, there for a long time. And on the death of both, actually, Frieda Mond donated them to King's College. And if you go there now, you'll see these two statues standing at the bottom of the staircase in the main building. So I just think this is lovely. There's a link between these and the block of flats in northwest London. Another example, which Val Bott may be familiar with, is in St Catherine's Court, Turnham Green. And this old tree is, again, situated next to a block of flats. Bit of research shows that it actually is on the site of Tower House, which was built by the architect Norman Shaw, who was the architect who designed most of Bedford Park. Now we see this is the house, the one in colour. The colour picture shows Tower House. When Shaw left, it got used as a convent for a while, and later on as a school, and you can find photographs of it before it was demolished to make way for the flats that are there today. And just interestingly, because I got interested in Norman Shaw, as I was walking around Hampstead near to where I live, I found Norman Shaw's other house that he designed and built for himself in Hampstead, which has a kind of design which is rather similar to the tower. Right, I'm going to close now. The website has hundreds of other examples of trees, mulberry trees. Some of them are old and some of them have stories. And to be honest, I don't actually know what's in there. It's the tip of the iceberg as far as this project is concerned. I don't have the money at the moment to develop this, but that's why I'm doing this in my own time. But my project ongoing is to research as many of these as I can, verify them and find out their stories, and to share these on the website, and also hopefully at some stage in a book of some kind. So I do recommend, if you want to know more, going to the website. So miraculously, I realized that I've actually finished on time. So thank you very much. I shall stop my share if I can do that.
You have indeed. That's absolutely fine. And
You
thank
stopped
you,
it for
Peter.
me, have you? Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Peter.
Right.
Brilliant. Now, folks, in the virtual world, we just show our appreciation, and if we have a few questions for Peter, we'll deal with that. But you can give Peter a virtual thumbs up, either from the chat box by inserting one of the emoticons. Some of you I can see have raised hands. It might be that you have a question to ask. If I can invite you to put your questions into the Q&A. If you can't see it on your screen, then float your mouse to the bottom and the toolbar should come up that gives you a Q&A. But I can see a number of people, are popping up their hands to say probably hello and thank you, but you might have a question as well. So let's just see. I've certainly got one question to ask you in a moment, Peter, before we take a couple of minutes before we transition. I'm just reading the chat, Peter, as we're going, that's coming into us. Many people sent you chat messages. Thank you. Richard's going to check out one a few meters away. Jane's giving her thanks. A few claps from people. Not everyone can do that on the webinar version, but you can pop a hand up. I'm just going to check just for a moment, Peter. We've got a few minutes for questions. Let's just see if there's a question that needs to be checked. Jane Cooper has a hand up. Jane, I've just allowed you to talk. If you do have a question, do so. Give you a chance to come unmute and ask. But in the meantime, while Jane may be able to ask a question, we have two coming in. Peter, we have Gillian who asks, what about the much disputed tree at Bow that has just been subject to a preservation order? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do you mean the one in Bethnal Green, the one in the London Chest Hospital?
I think we'll have to assume Gillian does until she gets her little keyboard working.
Because I know in Poplar, Bill Godfrey has talked about, Bob Godfrey rather has talked about trees there, but that's a young one. The one that was in the grounds of the London Chest Hospital is a really interesting example because it shows how attached local people can become to their bitter end trees, and in this particular case a mulberry tree, which has a history that goes back at least as old as the hospital was and has associations that go back to the 16th century. And that was a miraculous kind of effort on behalf of local people to stop it being moved in order to fit in with plans by developers who were supposed to be building affordable housing but ended up building planning a bunch of luxury flats. So the whole thing caused outrage by local people. They managed to raise enough money, thousands of pounds, to hire a QC who actually got the whole thing overturned. And now the developers are stuck and they have to redesign their plan and come up with an alternative to moving the tree because of the local protest to preserve a mulberry tree. And that's an amazing thing, really. It shows how much affection people have for these.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, I'm watching our time, but there's a couple more things I do need to ask you. Brenda sends thank you for an excellent talk. April Pittman asks, and if you can give me a quick answer, I want to check on a couple of others, but April Pittman's question is, which mulberry do silkworms prefer?
Okay.
And which did King James champion?
Right. That's kind of the whole thing that King James planted the wrong mulberries. The silkworm really is a natural host of the white mulberry tree, which is native to China and East Asia. And that's the tree that it's grown up in symbiosis with, and that's the one that is most successfully associated with the silk industry. And as the silk industry spread, so did the white mulberry come to areas into which it was not native. In the meantime, most of the area around the Persian Empire and then into the Eastern Mediterranean had native black mulberries. And the secret of silk came before the white mulberry came to these places. So they fed the silkworms very successfully on black mulberries. James I, we don't actually really know. He's championed the black mulberry, but he didn't really. He imported mulberry trees, and we think there may have been white mulberry trees. He certainly ordered them. They knew the difference at the time.
Okay. Thank you. And Jane Cooper has managed to send in a question in the chat. Thank you, Jane. We were looking for an audio, but that hasn't worked for us. And Jane Cooper's question is, are you aware of any mulberry trees at the Grove Hotel estate near Watford, which she understands at one point had a Tudor mansion before its house in the 1800s? And I think, Peter, I'll have to make this your last question, I'm afraid.
I'll have to look on the map, actually. I don't know. If it's there, then I'll certainly have a look later and try and follow it up. If it's not there, then perhaps you'd like to put it there. That would be great.
Okay, and I'm going to do one virtual check-in with Josephine Crocker, who has a hand up. Josephine, you may just be saying hi and thank you to Peter, but you may also have a question. So I'll just give you a moment in case you do need to say anything to us. There we go. I'm guessing she probably won't need to, Peter, but oh, there we go. Josephine, do you have an audio question for Peter?
No, I'm sorry. I was just thanking it. It's just thank you.
Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, attendees. Okay, let's move on.